Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Marketing Scientists. Today, I'll be speaking with Matt Henderson, who leads growth marketing at Sentry, a popular and high growth developer tool. Three things that I think you'll enjoy in this episode. So, Sentry killed all cookies on their website. The first thing we talk about is why did they do that? Second, how they were still able to grow the business through marketing without invading their audience's privacy. And finally, how do they measure the success of their marketing campaigns, even the ones that are considered hard to measure? So let's dive straight in. All right, Matt, this is going to be a ton of fun. I think this is the most anticipated podcast episode that I've had on my calendar. So expectations are high, okay? Um,
You're just hyping me up.
It's going to be great. So, while we're talking about this topic, I actually have the blog posts from Sentry up and running, and I'm going to sort of use that as a framework for us to have this conversation. So, the first thing that is very top of mind for everybody, especially what happened like last month, right? Google said, okay, we're actually not going to kill third-party cookies, but they might do something else. And that something else might look very much like what happened on iOS and Apple, where it's an opt-in model. Now, you were a trailblazer. You decided to do something about this last year, like almost a year ago. So
Yeah,
talk
it's
to
been
me
about a
about
year.
it has, yeah. So what were you seeing? What were you all seeing in the market that prompted you to take an action last year? And has anything about your initial hypothesis changed given Google's decision to backtrack from the third-party cookie deprecation?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just start with like how that happened. I work at Sentry. Sentry is an application monitoring platform for software developers. So out of any ICP, I think a software developer cares a lot about their privacy. Our co-founder is a former developer and still codes. We at our root are open source and started open source and recently moved to fair source, which is a new model. But I think if you think about those inputs, like it becomes a little bit more clear. So our co-founder was like, don't we want to respect our audience's privacy? Why do we have cookie banners on our website that talk about all these ways we're using your data? What would happen if we just removed it entirely? And so that's kind of what spurred everything on, was like, how could we respect our software developers who use Sentry's like privacy? And so, we at the same time we knew Google was trying to migrate everybody off of third party cookies, and it was going to be a painstaking process. Like, it was going to be a lot of work to do this. And if you think about it, it's like, should you spend all your energy migrating off of GA to GA4? Should you spend all your energy, like doing cookie audits, like working on all these different like enhanced conversions APIs for your ad platforms? And it became a lot more of like, well, what if we just spent all of our time like focusing on new channels and um, just like trusting our brand marketing and things like that. So that's kind of what happened in
Okay.
terms of like, how did this all kick off? How do we remove third party cookies from the site?
That's so very top down, very sort of mission oriented, very customer focused, right? Hey,
Yeah.
this is what our customers want. This is what developers want. I love that. Was that, when you first heard that, was your reaction as a marketer like, "Oh my god, not that," or were you like, "No, this is cool. Like, let's do it."
Oh no, it was the first thing. I was vehemently against it. I was, how can I surface data? How can I actually put a meeting on the books with our CFO and was like, I modeled out like, here's how much revenue I think we're going to lose from this based on our conversion rates, based on Google Ads relying on these signals. And it was this whole thing like, hey, I think we might lose about 30% of our new gross like paying customers. That seems like a lot. Maybe we should talk about this a little bit more seriously. And actually, what's interesting was just like the like commitment to it from top down, I think, was the way that it worked. Was like, okay, we're all committed to this. We know the risks now. We know we could lose a lot of this new acquisition, and we're still going to do it. And I think that after
Wow.
that, those conversations happened. I was totally on board. I was like, okay, this is actually an exciting challenge. How could I, like, one thing you need to know about me is I'm like heavy digital marketing, data oriented. How can I, prove out the value of this? Like, what's our attribution model? How do I figure out how to optimize and tweak this and down to the cent, right? And so when this came up, it was like, oh, man, how could I view this as a new challenge? So, like, what are the new motions that I could try that would help us grow? Because I've been a growth marketer for what, like 7 years now. So how could I continue to look forward at like what's the next optimization lever in this new world? So after I got over the whole like allergic reaction,
Yeah.
I that's when I started to buy in. So yeah.
That's fantastic. And I can appreciate that sentiment, right? Because if it's a top down thing, and at the end of the day, as a growth marketer, you're held accountable to those new growth targets, and suddenly this thing is taken away from you, I can imagine that being very political internally, even if it's not, coming from a political perspective. So that initial reaction of hesitation is warranted until
Yeah.
everybody gets on the same page about, like, hey, this is what it's risk. But love that. Okay, so you've been at it for a year.
Mhm.
Do you think anything is going to change given what Google has announced now? It sounds like not, because you're so mission oriented. But I'm curious if it has changed any perspectives over the last year. Any of the changes that have happened in the ecosystem?
No, I don't think so. I mean, they're pulling back on the idea of removal of cookies as you stated, and they just got ruled as a monopoly in some cases, and I think that's going to play out over the next few months. But what I think will change. I'm assuming you're asking, is anything going to change with Sentry's position on it? And
Correct. Yeah.
definitely not. I mean, I think if anything, it's like I don't know if you've seen this. I've seen people say the final death knell and third party cookies is now going to be in the hands of the users, which I thought was a good way of summarizing it. Like, this is still shifting away from this heavy, usage of personal data to more of like a privacy first approach. And so I think if
Yeah.
anything, we have a head start now on all the motions and all the, internal muscle building of like, here's how we grow Sentry from a top of funnel perspective. So
Oh, I
yeah,
love
I
that.
think if anything, we're more committed. Yeah.
That's fantastic, right? You're basically saying, hey, we know the whole industry is moving this way and we got a head start. Amazing. Love it. Okay. So I have so many questions. By the way, we did the same thing after I saw your post, like in January or Feb, we killed all third party cookies. So my first question is, what do you do for your website analytics? What are you guys using, if you're able to share? And I'll share, like, we're using this thing called Fathom Analytics.
Okay.
It works. It's got a few gaps, but it works, and completely PII friendly. And it gives me what I need. What do you all use?
Yeah. So we initially, for me again, our Google reps were talking to us when we were making this transition. And they were like, please shift over to GA4. Like, we were going to try to help transition everybody over to GA4. And the deeper we got into it, it was like, yeah, we could use all these signals still in Google Ads, and maybe this would help us kind of work around it. And the more legal conversations we had, the longer this was drawn out. It was like, like, there's still some practices that we were unhappy with, so we actually made a full switch to Plausible, which is similar. It seems like
Cool.
Fathom and Plausible are kind of like some of the main alternatives, and it's super lightweight. It's so it helps with site speed, I think, in some ways, and it gives you pretty much everything you need. But it's very simple and bare bones, which I kind of like. Actually, I've started to really, it's grown on me a lot. At first, I was like, "This is not GA," but it grew on me quite a bit.
Yeah, I have the same reaction to Fathom, and I'll check out Plausible as well and see if there's anything interesting there. Okay, so that's good on analytics. Now, there's so much in B2B SaaS that relies on cookies, right? So let's start with a few categories. This whole idea of, intent signals, whether it's first party or third party, right? And some people do it in a cookie-less way, where they're looking at job changes or things like that. But then some people are doing it based on, user behavior on your website, user behavior on your dev docs. Do
Right.
you all do any of that, or have you kind of said no, we don't want to do that?
Yeah, since we're in dev marketing, we use a tool called Common Room, which helps kind of look in
Mhm.
GitHub repositories and more like dev areas, I would say, that where developers hang out, and kind of surfaces signals of like, hey, this person's like commenting on XYZ. That's about as it's mostly offsite. We don't do anything on our website. Hey, you're digging into our docs or something like that, which could enable product led sales and all these other things. Like we're committed to the idea of no user tracking on our site, and so that does present a ton of challenges. And I've brought up, hey, hey, does this tool work? Hey, does this tool work? I talk with my legal team a lot, but yeah, that we definitely don't do anything on site. We do a lot of other signals that are off site. Yeah.
Got it. And
What
so that's great. Common Room is awesome. Love the team there. Love the product. I have to get started using it ourselves. So how do you then handle something like personalization on the website, or there's a big sort of idea around ABM and doing sort of account specific landing pages and things of that nature. Any of that, or like it's all sort of focused on benefits and specific solution pages and things of that nature now?
Yeah, I mean, so Sentry's main focus is on the individual software developer, whereas like which I think lends itself to this whole, privacy first approach. So we don't need necessarily to do a lot of that because it's mostly one to many. It's mostly like any software developer can benefit from Sentry because we help surface issues in their code and help make it easier to solve it. So that's really our target, and because we're not super dependent on that like enterprise sales motion, we don't do a lot of that like personalization kind of motion. But it I will say, as more and more complex you know marketing tactics come up, and hey, how could we reach X account, or how could we do this more sophisticated ABM approach, it does make it a little bit trickier. Okay, we can't use this, we can't use this. Maybe we can use metadata to capture our ICP and then proliferate it to the channels, and then when we pull them in, we could do some sort of Salesforce. Like there's a lot of conversation about how could we track this in a way that is more just account oriented for
Got it.
our sales motions, because we have a sales motion and a self-serve motion.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
Okay, so you mentioned a
it's
few
tricky.
names there. It's tricky for sure, and maybe somebody who's listening to this podcast will come up with a product idea in connecting the dots there without using cookies. Maybe it'll be Paramark. Who knows?
There you
Uh,
go.
so, question for you about targeting, right? So you talked
Hmm.
about this in the blog post as well. How did you, with this change, right? How did you change your targeting strategy on the ad platforms with regards to your growth marketing slash performance marketing tactics? What did that look like?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you think about it, how many ad platforms were moving to the idea of let's use all these buying signals or intent signals to train an algorithm to find the right audience for you. So if you think about like Performance Max and Google, how can we just do everything for you, make it a suit like one click, we'll find everybody for you, just install like all this sophisticated tracking. And that was gone like as soon as we had to remove everything and after we did our cookie audit. And so all these like traditional ad channels that we were super trained, like had super trained algorithms, were like no longer as valuable. Like we still definitely rely on them, but we're doing old school stuff like enhanced CPC on Google, and old school just keyword level targeting, that kind of thing. But what really changed, which I think is probably the most interesting aspect of this whole thing, was we had to start relying on other channels, um, that gave us a guaranteed access to reach our ICP, which we
Mhm.
could no longer do with these like sophisticated algorithms. Like we couldn't rely on display marketing or some of these other channels. Um, and so what we really did was invested a lot into podcasts. We invested a lot into newsletters. We invested a lot into influencers, or like we call them builders, which are just developers who
Yeah.
are building tools, building things, and then integrating tools into it. So those are the kind of channel, like we own our own podcast. That's another thing.
Mm.
Syntax.fm. And there's just like, Yeah, there's those are the channels that started to unlock, okay, now we're reaching our audience still. And you might not look at those kinds of channels if you were beholden to multi-touch attribution or something that wouldn't necessarily show the value of those kinds of channels. So that's where I shifted probably 60 or 70% of my time to, is like, how do we find these audiences in
Okay.
different ways?
I like what you said about these are channels that help you reach your audience in a very specific way. And you're not trying to wade through some AI driven algorithm in Google and Meta and LinkedIn. So, on that note, I do have a clarification though. If you were running on Google or on Meta, you can still do some type of first party data integrations and pass in, hashed emails, hashed phone numbers, what have you. Or was that also part of your sort of, privacy centric approach of like, you're not going to do that?
Yeah, when it comes to like the legal ramifications of removing a cookie banner. It doesn't just stop with something I learned very quickly, was it doesn't just stop with third party cookies. So the
Mhm.
idea is like, are you doing any user tracking? What does that look like? And you can't. Yeah, I'm sure. Did you run into this as well when you were going through it? Yeah,
We're not doing much of performance marketing just yet, given we're early and that's not a big channel for us. Organic social has been massive,
yeah.
but I'm sure we did the same thing. We removed all the consent issues, and so if you don't have consent and you can't take that and put it into elsewhere, then
hmm
that's why I was like even asking about this question, right? So it's basically Cappy is dead.
Cappy's dead. Using the Gclid to do offline passback in Google's dead. Enhanced conversions is dead. Any Salesforce or like CRM integration, it gets you'd be surprised at the amount of things you're like, well, wait, this isn't using third party cookies, but we are doing user tracking in this way. And I think that, again, it comes down to, are you committed? Like, is your company committed to this? Which is,
Yeah,
luckily we were committed, because there'd be a lot of turnaround points that you run into.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And if I think about sort of your positioning as well, because you're going after developers, this
hmm
is also very like if you look at Apple's biggest sort of messaging in the last couple of years has been privacy, 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 right? And I have to imagine that they've gotten a lot of good positive mind share as a result of that. Now we won't go into like some of the
hmm
gray area with Apple, but there's a lot of positive connotations around the approach that you've taken. So um, we talked about targeting, and you mentioned okay, now you're doing podcasts, newsletters, more old school stuff. So when you do those, how do you as a growth marketer think about, hey, how much more money should I put into a podcast or a newsletter? How do you make the tactical decisions on a monthly basis?
That's a great question. I actually, whenever anybody talks to me about cookies, they usually talk to me about that. And what I say is usually like, we we had to go backwards in time, almost in some respects. So we do kind of like a two-part method, I would say, maybe three-part. One is we installed a Heidi How survey. So how did you hear about us?
Mhm.
After you sign up. So the same day that you sign up, and it just basically is an open text field that says, "How did you hear about us?" And so we get a lot of responses in that from all the signups that we get, and in turn, I look at that quarterly and I compare it over time. And just say, okay, are the way people are hearing about us, is that changing at all? Um, and you'd be surprised about the results that I get from that. Hey, I heard you on this podcast, or hey, this one YouTuber mentioned you. And if there's enough like volume there, I've just gotten in the habit of, okay, I'm going to go reach out to these people and see if we can sponsor their
Nice.
podcast or talk to them. And that's been something that I found a lot of value in. And it's not the end all be all though. So the other part of this is, we still do have UTMs. That is one thing you still can do. Um,
Mm,
and so that definitely, developers don't click on ads a lot. We know that a lot of people don't click on ads, but it does still give you, we were able to retain kind of like a last click, maybe like
mm,
what I would say, maybe 40% of our attribution model. So we're able to say, last click, where did you come from? Did you come from Google? Did you come from some other website, or did you come from an ad on this channel or that channel? And that actually has been enough of like a, hey, this is the general direction of where people are coming to hear about you or coming to sign up or turning into paying customers from. And then you use the survey as a gut check of like, okay, are these two things matching up? And if there's strong signals, we pursue those kinds of things. So those are maybe the two ways. And then the third could be we look a lot at blended data. So how
Mhm.
much are we inputting? And maybe if we make changes month over month or quarter over quarter, what is the blended outcome? And
Got it.
look at that, which has been really, really helpful as well.
Got it. And that's great. And I want to sort of hype up this point. You've now done cookieless for like a year. I'm
Hmm.
assuming business is going pretty well. You don't have to comment on that. And you're still in the job, which means
Yeah,
you're doing
something's going okay.
something's going okay,
Yeah.
and you're spending dollars and you're seeing results. So just like a shout out to folks who over index on, hey, I need all these like sophisticated measurement to be able to do things. Maybe, but maybe not when you're starting out or when you're at a certain scale. You can absolutely do this. Now, one other question for you, right? There are obviously channels that are perceived as harder to measure, right? So things like, hey, and I've seen you guys do billboards sometimes. Um, how did you all think about those? How do you track like a billboard or a podcast? Podcast, well, you kind of mentioned, right? Maybe how did you hear about us to some degree? But can you share something more about billboards or other harder to measure channels? What are you doing there?
Yeah. So actually just got done running a coordinated out of home campaign, which is actually the first time I've taken a look at that. I'm more of a digital base like marketer. And so doing out of home was really fun. I got to take like a little bit of my approach to that. And so what was really interesting with that campaign in particular was we had two tentpole like in-person events in Berlin. And uh, a year ago, we went to both of those events as well and had a presence there. And so we were able to kind of surround the city of Berlin with this message of like, Sentry now has support for EU data residency. If you want to store your data in the EU, we can support that. It was a small feature that means a lot to a lot of privacy and like industries
Hmm.
that need compliance. And so we wanted to just remind people like, hey, our company can now serve you in the ways that you need to. And so what was really interesting about that campaign was, and how we measured it was, okay, year over year, what was the event outcome? So did we
Hmm.
have more qualified leads? Did we have more badge scans? What was the attendance like? And it was really interesting. We had quite a bit of like tangible lift in the qualified leads that came from that event, both of those two events, which was a really good signal to me. Because I've been a part of out of home campaigns before, and often you're like, I don't really know, I can't really tell.
Yeah.
But that was one thing I looked at, and then I also looked, and I look at this all the time, which is just our total branded searches, and I
Mm.
looked at that month over month over month, before the campaign, during the campaign, and after the campaign, and specifically when we had our out of home up. And so I was able to show like, hey, actually we're seeing quite a bit of lift in this region compared to globally, or in this region compared to the US. So it was kind of a factor of like branded lift, how many more people are coming to and searching and Googling, and then also the tentpole event impact. And then, you know, there's probably 30,
That's great.
40% that we still don't understand, right? But
Yeah. But that's a great sort of way to get started, right? So for all those folks who say, hey, don't waste money on a billboard, well, you can actually see the impact if you run it well and if you know what you're doing. And that's what you. One question: was this a first party event or a third party event?
it was a third party. Both of them were third
Cool.
party events for software developers. Yeah.
Okay. Very cool. Amazing. Okay, so let's talk about, you and I got connected after that blog post, and I know that you've looked at some solutions in the space, right? So if you had to dream up a privacy friendly, marketing measurement platform, what would it do for you? Like, and I'm not asking about Paramark, right? I'm like, if
Yeah.
you had a magic wand that you could wave that gave you an answer,
Oh
what,
my
what would
gosh.
that look like?
This is the best question. I love this. I think what comes to mind is like, how do I know how much more, like exactly the dollar amount more to the cent that I should invest in podcasts, that I should invest in, YouTube advertising, that we should invest in content. And those are the kinds of things that, like, that would be great. I think obsessing over the exact dollar amount is something I've learned to kind of like, this is not as important as just testing. But I think if it just kind of unlocked new channels that we should invest in and help us get to kind of like that equilibrium of like, okay, we're spending this much on search this month, and we know that it's providing the ROI that we need. As a digital or growth marketer, that helps you kind of justify your budget, have hard conversations about what we should invest in, pull back in certain areas, just allocate like the right resources at the right things. So that would be great. I would love to be able to quantify like revenue, like towards investment. What's the cost to acquire a customer by channel? That would just, I mean, that
Yeah,
might exist
that's
today,
great.
but that'd be great.
No, that's fantastic. So for all of our competitors who are listening, there you go. You've got some feature ideas right there.
Yeah.
But that's awesome, Matt. Okay, so on a different note, right? So you talked about how much should I invest more, and how do you all tackle that conversation internally? Are you sort of, working with your finance counterpart on a monthly basis? Are you doing forecasts? Like, is that your responsibility? Is it the finance person's responsibility? What does the process look like today?
I mean, I think anybody who manages a paid media budget should have like regular check-ins, probably with their CFO. And when I first started here, I did it monthly. So it was like, here's how much we're spending. Here are the channels that we're seeing value from. You know, here's what I, you know, here's what I think is going to happen next month. And like you said, kind of like, here's what happened. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's what I'm forecasting. And just kind of like gut checking, like, hey, here's my strategy. I hope you're aligned. If not, like, let's talk about it. And then slowly over time, that's moved more to a quarterly meeting.
Mm.
And I think that's key, is just like that alignment of like, okay, just like, it's just anytime you're managing a budget, I think it's really important to make sure that you're doing it in a responsible way that everybody, including the finance team, agrees with. And like, it seems like a simple thing, but I've found that those meetings are very revealing. It's like you get a lot of insights into, I don't know. You get a lot of insights into, we don't really understand, why you guys are doing, why you guys are investing so much in YouTube, or why you guys are writing this series of content. And I think it also provides a good opportunity to just educate. And I found that meetings like QBRs and other meetings go a lot smoother because everybody's on the same page from those calls. So yeah,
Right.
I'm
So
a big fan of that. That's
you're doing this outside of the QBRs, not
mhm.
necessarily as part of the QBRs. So there's a prep that happens, and you've answered most of the questions in detail. That's super smart. Um, on that note, the conversation with finance and in a B2B SaaS, especially given you all are so bottoms up, PLG, etc. How do you define success for marketing? Like, is it a developer sign up? Is it a qualified sign up? Is it an opportunity? Like, I'm actually pretty curious about how you do that.
Yeah, so our product's pretty easy to sign up for. Like, that's one thing we try to do, is reduce all friction. Um, and then I think what I love to look at, and what I was training Google on, was just like some of these more product, you could call it a PQL, but just these product activated leads. Like, hey, this person's consuming X amount of product, or they kind of have gotten to a critical mass of like, they're actually using it, and we understand that. that's that weeds out a lot of the bots. It weeds out a lot of the spam signups. It weeds out a lot of people who aren't interested. And then you can kind of look at the dollars allocated versus the amount of people engaging with the product. I think that's a great signal that doesn't have too much latency in it. And because if you try to do CAC and revenue, which I definitely still look at, and I look at it on cohorted and non-cohorted basis, but I think if you look at things from like a CAC perspective, there's too much latency into understanding, hey, we invested here and we're not seeing the revenue impact yet. Well, sometimes it takes quite a bit of time, right? So I really like to look at those product activations.
Love it.
And yeah, and then also we have to measure the sales side too, right? So we have a little bit, we look at, engaged leads and those kinds of things as well, pipeline.
Got it. Fantastic. So leading indicators is how you're
Mm.
driving it. And then are you coming up with some like target, numbers in terms of this is the cost per, I'm just making this up, activated, user, or
Mhm.
cost per,
Yep.
qualified lead. And that's sort of your target that you're driving towards.
Yeah, and like I said, we still have some semblance of UTM understanding, especially with the channel like search where you click usually. We can still kind of look at, okay, we have a cost to per activated lead, and is that a number we're happy with based on the revenue we think will come from this, and how could we improve this over time? And like you're saying, how can we maximize this? If you're in a growth mindset, not a contraction mindset, how could we invest in more channels and try to see if it affects that cost? So that's basically the foundation for how we have those kinds of conversations. Like, should we invest in this new expensive, shiny new object or something like that?
Cool. Very cool. What's the makeup of the marketing and growth team more broadly? Like you're running growth
Hmm.
marketing. What are the other big sort of, teams that are together working on sort of growth?
Yeah. So we have PMM, like a lot of other B2Bs. We have DevRel, which is maybe not as familiar to people who aren't in dev marketing, but they act as like content engine, but also just going to conferences and doing a lot of the community engagement. And we have a great team, and they create YouTube videos, they create tutorials, they help with the docs, and they just understand boots on the ground, like what your audience needs because they are former developers most of the time, or they also are developers. So that gives you kind of that internal voice of reason. So that team's very, very tightly woven with us. A lot of their content is what we use in a lot of these distribution channels. So yeah, and we also have a demand gen team that focus on sales led and education and doing workshops and live events and also in person events. Um, so yeah, those are kind of like the pillars I would say. Mhm.
Do you think any of them, like those teams, right? Product marketing, DevRel, demand gen, how do they view this cookie-less world? Do they have the same, frustrations, or, the like, are they also like you, like gung ho about going down this path? Like, I'm curious what their take is.
I get a lot of questions of like, "Hey, do you know how much impact this had?" Or the DevRel team and I talk all the time about like, "Hey, we just did this entire quarter of content series, and we
Right.
want to understand the impact." And we use tools like Plausible to understand page views and how dwell rate and things like that. But in visits to certain other pages, but it's very very hard to assign like a revenue value to that, and that I think that's a very tricky challenge. Is just I think even with cookies, it's like, can you truly understand the value of written content in the long
Mm,
term play of organic search? So I'd say like those are definitely we have. There's always questions that cannot be answered, and it is kind of like frustrating. But I think everybody on the team is aligned. Like this is done. Like we're not
right.
dwelling on the fact that we don't have cookies. Like nobody brings that up in meetings anymore, and it's more
Nice.
okay. Like okay, we understand that's not going to be measurable, but we still feel very convicted that this is our message that we need to get out there. So I would say there's a little bit more of like gut based decision making, which is like old. You might see that as old school, but I think maybe that is what marketing might start. I think that might start growing in terms of what marketers need to start relying on, which is instincts.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a reason you have human beings in this seat, right?
Yeah.
Is to use your brain and your gut and your instinct. Okay, this is awesome. Um, so we're coming up on the end here. When I have one last question for you, which is, what are you seeing in B2B or developer marketing that is something new and exciting that you haven't seen before? So, and I don't
Hmm.
know if anything that like that exists, but like, is there a new shiny object, or a new sort of tactic, strategy, anything that comes to mind, given you're in the trenches doing this work today?
Okay, yeah, let me give you a couple. I'm really excited about I just saw some stats that said podcast spending is up 22% year over year. I'm just really excited about podcast spending because you always think about I think at least before we went on this privacy road trip, I would say I was always like man, we should be doing that more. And it's really
Mm.
exciting to see other companies starting to invest more in podcasts. Influencer spending's up 10%. I was looking at in an article this morning. But I think like, yeah, I'd say like with AI, of course, everybody's talking about it. But I think what's really interesting is Google's starting to really favor human oriented content. And like, I don't know if you've seen this, but Google's really starting to reward Reddit and Quora,
Yeah.
Medium, and folks in forums and conversations, and they're also favoring like strongly structured websites that have authors and author pages.
Mm.
And so
Mm.
that's, I think, really exciting, is the idea of like, okay, maybe this wave of like AI generated like fluff content is starting to end, and we're starting to move into more high value human oriented conversations. But then on the same vein of AI, I think I'm really interested in tools and technology that are starting to enable like AI workflows. I don't know if you've played around with any of these or seen any of these recently, but the idea of it's not just a chatbot. It's I'm doing multi-step workflows where LLMs are inputting to web scrapers are inputting to LLMs, and I'm automating workflows that used to take a long, long time. So those, I
Yeah.
think those are the main ones that I'm super excited about. What about you? What do you think
You
about
give
that?
me some new ideas. No, this is awesome. You give me some new ideas. I've always been fascinated about the whole LLM and automation sort of combination, right? So Clay doing some things, Zapier doing
Hmm.
some things. There's a few other folks. Relay, I think, is doing some things. Um, Frankly, I just haven't had the time to dig in and play with them, but I'm like waiting for a good weekend to go do that. Um, I hadn't actually heard about the podcast and the influencer stats, so that's awesome to see increased investment. I definitely see the value. There's a reason we're doing this podcast. I'm a big podcast listener, and so to me, it makes a lot of
Same.
sense. The Google piece was new information for me, so thanks for sharing that. And it makes so much sense, right? That if you have an actual author, that you can confirm the identity because you have sort of digital tracking, right? Like I can see Pranav on
Hmm.
paramount.com is the same Pranav on LinkedIn, and I've got a
Yeah.
Google account with Pranav. That somehow gives it more weight than a completely anonymous blog post. That's really cool. Um, I saw something today from HubSpot. You know how they had a website grader a decade ago? Do you remember this? That you
I
could
don't
go and
remember
like
this.
grade your website
What?
from HubSpot. They just launched a new thing, which is your AI grader. So you can put in
Oh,
your brand name and see what AI says about your brand across multiple AIs, right? So
wow.
I thought that was pretty cool to, and that must be a massive lead asset for HubSpot. So kudos for them for
They're so good at those.
bringing.
Those
They're so
those
good at
easy
those.
lead gen magnets. Yeah, they're great at those.
Exactly.
You should
Exactly.
there's this, I'll have to dig this up and share it, or we can share it sometime offline, but there's this new idea of, SEO for these LLMs and these like bots is like, how is that going to like, how are SEOs going to figure this out? And I see this a lot in the community. And one
Mm.
person I talked to is building sort of like this pinging solution that pings LLMs to understand your brand. And he was calling it, I'll have to give him proper credit later, but it was share of model, which is rather than share of voice. So
Yep.
for all the models, like which ones know you for what you want, and how can you influence that? How can you tweak that? How can you test that? I thought that was a really interesting potential
It makes a lot of
movement.
sense.
Hmm.
You make a bunch of content, you ping that service, you see if the LLMs have picked it up, and that's like an always on experimentation process, right? So I like it. I like it. That becomes your LLM optimization. Need
Yeah,
a
I
more
think
elegant
that's
word for that.
really, yeah, I know, right? We need to workshop it. SEO is just very, catchy, but yeah.
Amazing. Well, Matt, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of this wisdom. I hope folks who are listening in can take some inspiration from here, and may they unlock more growth in a privacy-oriented world. So, thanks again for sharing and coming on.
Yeah, great catching up. Thank you so much.
All right, folks, that was Matt Henderson, who leads growth marketing at Sentry. Tune in next week. We'll have even more fun and insightful conversations all about the science of marketing.